Clint Eastwood's house in Carmel, California, has long been rumored to have an unexpected guest, a ghostly presence that lingers in the shadows of his grand estate. Given Eastwood's long history with the town, having even served as its mayor, it's no surprise that his home might carry echoes of the past. The legend goes that the mansion was built on land with a rich and somewhat mysterious history. Some say it was once the site of an old Spanish outpost, while others believe it was part of a sprawling ranch where duels and shootouts occasionally ended in tragedy. The most commonly reported activity happens in Eastwood's private office. Visitors have claimed to hear the rustle of papers when no one is inside, and some insist they've seen the shadow of a man standing near the bookshelves. There are whispers that the presence belongs to an old film director, one who never finished his masterpiece and now haunts the legendary actor, hoping to get his final scene right. More eerie still are the sounds that echo through the house at night. Footsteps click across the wooden floors, slow and measured, like a cowboy pacing before a duel. Muffled voices drift through the halls, as if someone is rehearsing dialogue from an old western. But when Eastwood or any guest goes to investigate, the house is silent once more. One particularly chilling tale comes from a housekeeper who once worked in the mansion. She recalled entering the office to tidy up when she felt a sudden chill in the air. As she turned to leave, she heard a deep voice behind her whisper, "Go ahead. Make my day." She fled the room, only to find out later that Eastwood himself wasn't home that day. Whether the ghost is a former director, a long-lost cowboy, or simply a trick of the imagination, one thing is certain: Clint Eastwood's Carmel estate holds a mystery worthy of one of his own films. Years passed, and as Clint Eastwood spent more time away from his Carmel estate, he eventually decided to sell the house. The new owners, a young couple named Daniel and Sarah Whitman, were drawn to the mansion's rustic charm and Hollywood history. They weren't superstitious, nor did they believe in ghosts, at least not at first. Their first few nights in the house were peaceful. The ocean breeze whispered through the trees, and the grand windows bathed the rooms in golden California sunlight. But as they began to settle in, strange occurrences started to unfold. It began with the office. Daniel, a screenwriter, had eagerly claimed the space as his workspace, inspired by the thought that Clint Eastwood himself had once worked there. But every time he sat down to write, an unsettling presence filled the room. Papers would shift on their own. The old wooden floor would creak as if someone were pacing just behind him. One night, deep in thought, he absently muttered a line of dialogue aloud, only to hear a raspy voice whisper it back to him. Sarah experienced something even stranger. She loved old westerns and had set up a small home theater in one of the mansion's grand rooms. One evening, while watching The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, the film suddenly froze. At first, she thought it was just a glitch, but then the screen flickered, and for a split second, an image of a shadowy cowboy standing in their own living room appeared on the screen. Her heart pounded as she turned, half expecting to see someone behind her. The room was empty. As weeks passed, the ghostly presence became bolder. Late at night, the couple would wake to the sound of boots slowly crossing the upstairs hallway. Sometimes, a faint murmur of voices would drift through the house, as if someone were rehearsing a long-forgotten script. One night, Daniel awoke to the sound of a deep sigh beside the bed. In the dim glow of the moonlight, he swore he saw a figure in an old cowboy hat standing at the foot of the bed. Just as he reached for the lamp, the figure tipped its hat and vanished. Desperate for answers, the Whitmans spoke with a local historian who had researched the land's history. What they learned was chilling. Long before Eastwood had built his estate, the land had been home to a mysterious drifter, a failed actor who had once dreamed of making it big in Hollywood, but never got his break. Some said he had challenged a rival to a duel on that very land and lost. Others believed he had spent his final years wandering Carmel, muttering lines from movies that never cast him. The Whitmans, realizing their ghost might simply be looking for recognition, tried something unusual. One evening, they set up a projector in the office and played a reel of silent Western films from the early 1900s. As the flickering images danced across the wall, the air in the room became noticeably lighter. The footsteps ceased. The whispers faded. From that night on, the disturbances lessened. The ghost of Carmel still lingered, But now, instead of pacing in frustration, it seemed to watch over them in quiet satisfaction, finally acknowledged, at last. The Whitmans thought the haunting had finally settled. The office no longer carried that oppressive weight. The whispers had faded, and the eerie presence seemed content until one stormy night proved them wrong. It started with the lights flickering. At first, Daniel assumed it was just the weather, but then the television in the home theater turned on by itself. Static crackled across the screen before an old Western film began to play, one neither of them had put on. The strange part? The footage was unfamiliar. It was grainy, black and white, and showed a lone cowboy standing in the desert, his hand resting on his holster. He stared directly at the camera, eyes hollow, his mouth moving as if speaking, but there was no sound. The film jumped, flickered, and then the cowboy was suddenly closer. The next frame, even closer. Sarah felt a chill crawl up her spine as the screen froze on his face, which was now so near it felt like he was looking straight through them. Then, the sound returned. A deep, rasping voice echoed through the house, but it didn't come from the television. "You took my scene." Daniel turned off the TV. The voice remained. "You took my scene." Sarah grabbed his arm. "Did you hear that?" Before he could answer, the projector in the office clicked on. The same strange Western film started playing again. But now, the cowboy wasn't alone. There was another shadowy figure standing in the distance, waiting. The house groaned as if something within its walls had shifted. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, heavier than before. They weren't just pacing now. They were coming closer. And this time, the Whitmans weren't sure if the ghost only wanted to be seen, or if it wanted something more. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The footsteps stopped just outside the office door. The house fell silent, thick with tension. Daniel and Sarah exchanged a look neither of them dared to move. Then the doorknob rattled. A gust of cold air swept through the room as the door creaked open. The office was dark, except for the flickering light of the projector. The old Western film was still playing, but now the cowboy in the frame had drawn his gun. His eyes empty, shadowed, seemed to lock onto Daniel. Then the whisper came again. "Time to finish it." The words weren't coming from the film. They were inside the room. Daniel swallowed hard and stepped forward. His pulse pounded as he watched the screen. The cowboy lifted his gun. But something was wrong. The film looked clearer now, too crisp for something so old. And then Daniel realized this wasn't just a film. The cowboy raised his hand and pointed. Not at someone in the scene. At Daniel. Sarah gasped. Daniel, step back. But he couldn't move. The projector light flared, casting long, unnatural shadows. The cowboy's hand twitched near his holster. The distant figure in the film, the one who had been waiting in the background, took a step forward. The air in the room thickened, pressing against them. The floorboards groaned under an unseen weight. The ghost wasn't just replaying an old scene anymore. It was reliving it. And Daniel? He wasn't sure if he was just watching, or if he was about to become part of it. Daniel's breath hitched as the air in the office seemed to crackle with electricity. The cowboy in the film stood completely still, his fingers hovering over his holster. The distant figure behind him blurred and shadowed moved closer. The film's flickering light cast their silhouettes across the walls, stretching and twisting like something alive. Then the whisper returned. This time it was right behind him. "Pick it up." Daniel turned his head ever so slightly and froze. On the desk, where only blank pages had been moments ago, now sat an old, dust-covered revolver. It wasn't his. It wasn't supposed to be there. Sarah grabbed his arm. "Daniel, don't." But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting, that this wasn't just about watching a ghostly replay. This was a challenge. The cowboy in the film curled his fingers. The second figure, now fully visible, wore a long coat and a hat pulled low over his face. His head tilted slightly, as if he was considering Daniel, weighing his fate. And then the screen jerked. The image blurred, flickered, and suddenly the cowboy wasn't standing in the film anymore. He was walking out of it. The light from the projector swirled like a dust storm, and the temperature in the room plummeted. Daniel felt his breath leave him in a sharp gasp. The cowboy's boots hit the floor with a solid, echoing thud. He wasn't just a shadow. He wasn't just a trick of the film. He was here. Sarah stumbled backward, her hands clamped over her mouth. The cowboy lifted his head, his eyes hidden beneath the brim of his hat. But Daniel could feel his stare burning into him. The second figure, the one who had been waiting in the background, remained in the film, watching from just beyond the veil of reality. And then the cowboy spoke. His voice was dry, cracked, and full of something ancient. "We settle this now." The room seemed to stretch, the furniture fading into the dark. The walls pressed back, making way for something bigger, something that shouldn't exist inside a house. The office had transformed into a street. A dusty, moonlit street, like the kind from old westerns. But this wasn't just a set. This wasn't just a dream. Daniel realized with a sickening twist in his gut. He was no longer in his home, and the duel had already begun. Daniel's boots scraped against the dirt. But he wasn't wearing boots. He looked down, his sneakers were gone. In their place were worn leather cowboy boots, caked in dust. His jeans had been replaced with rugged trousers, and a long coat hung from his shoulders, heavy with the weight of time. The revolver was in his hand. He didn't remember picking it up. The street stretched in both directions, empty and silent, except for the wind kicking up swirls of dust. The air smelled of old leather, gunpowder, and something else, something cold, like the breath of the dead. Across from him, the cowboy stood motionless, hand hovering over his holster. His shadow stretched long under the pale glow of an unseen moon. His face was still obscured, but Daniel could feel his stare. Unblinking, expectant. The second figure, the one from the film, remained behind him, just at the edge of sight, watching from the boundary between worlds. Sarah was gone. The house was gone. This was real. The cowboy finally spoke, his voice like wind through dry leaves. "You took my scene." Daniel's grip tightened on the revolver. "I don't even know who you are." The cowboy didn't move. No one does. A gust of wind rolled down the empty street, rattling the loose shutters of a ghost town that had no right to exist. A tumbleweed drifted past. Daniel swallowed. His heart pounded. He knew how this worked. This was a duel. And there was only one way a duel could end. His mind raced. Was this how the ghost had died? Had he been killed in an unfinished western? Or was this something older? A moment in time, forever waiting to be completed? Daniel took a slow step back. "I don't want to do this." The cowboy's fingers twitched. "You don't have a choice." The second figure stirred in the distance. Daniel couldn't see his face, but he could feel it. He was waiting, watching, judging. The revolver in Daniel's hand felt impossibly heavy. His breath came fast and shallow. The cowboy spoke again. "The scene has to end." Daniel's stomach twisted. This was why the ghost haunted the house. The duel had never finished. A sharp gust of wind howled through the empty town, kicking up dust. Somewhere a distant church bell rang once. The cowboy straightened. His hand hovered just above his gun. Daniel felt something shift in the air. It was time. The second figure in the distance took another step forward. The weight of his presence pressed down on Daniel's chest. He felt like a man standing on a train track, watching the locomotive rush toward him, unable to move. His fingers twitched. His body tensed. The cowboy narrowed his eyes. The duel had begun, and Daniel wasn't sure if he was fast enough to survive. The wind died. The world held its breath. Daniel felt sweat bead at the back of his neck, but the air was cold, unnaturally cold. His fingers tensed around the revolver's grip, the worn leather warm, pulsing like a heartbeat. Across from him, the cowboy stood still as stone, his hand hovering over his holster. He didn't blink. He didn't breathe. He was waiting. The second figure in the distance took another step forward. The closer he got, the heavier the air became, like the weight of unseen hands pressing against Daniel's chest. Who was he? A judge? A witness? Or something worse? Daniel's instincts screamed at him to run. But there was nowhere to go. This wasn't just a duel. This was a moment caught in time, refusing to die. The cowboy finally moved. His fingers curled. The leather of his holster creaked. Daniel's pulse slammed against his ribs. The cowboy's voice came low, edged with something ancient. "You took my scene." A whisper slithered through the wind. "Not just yours." The cowboy stiffened. The second figure had spoken. Daniel's breath hitched. His grip tightened. The cowboy didn't turn, but something in his stance changed. A flicker of hesitation. The second figure took another step forward. Closer. The air crackled, charged like the moment before a lightning strike. Daniel's mind raced. This wasn't just about the cowboy. There was someone else caught in this duel. Someone unseen. But before he could process it, the cowboy moved. His hand snapped to his gun. The revolver in Daniel's grip burned, as if demanding action. The air split. A shot rang out. But Daniel never pulled the trigger. And in the fraction of a second that followed, he realized. Neither had the cowboy, yet someone had fired. The bullet tore through the night, the echo stretching impossibly long. Daniel's ears rang. The cowboy's face finally lifted from the shadows. His eyes locked onto Daniel's. And Daniel saw it. Fear. Not anger. Not rage. Fear. The cowboy's mouth opened like he wanted to speak. But before he could, his body jerked back, as if yanked by an unseen force. His figure flickered. A wind howled through the empty town. And then, darkness. Darkness swallowed everything. For a moment, Daniel felt like he was floating, weightless in a vast, empty void. The cold wrapped around him like a shroud, and the silence pressed against his ears, thick and suffocating. Then, a whisper. "It wasn't supposed to be me." Daniel gasped as his body was yanked downward. The darkness peeled away like torn film, and suddenly he was back. The ghost town reassembled itself around him, dust swirling, shadows stretching. The pale glow of an unseen moon casting the street in silver light. But something was wrong. The cowboy was gone. The second figure, the one who had been watching, waiting, stood alone in the street now. Daniel's breath hitched. His heart pounded. The wind kicked up, and as the dust settled, Daniel saw him clearly for the first time. A long coat, a wide-brimmed hat. His face still obscured by shadow, but his presence was undeniable. He was the one who had fired. Daniel's grip tightened on the revolver. His whole body tensed. Who was he? And more importantly, why had the cowboy been afraid of him? The figure took a step forward, the sound of his boots like a hammer striking wood. This was never his duel. Daniel's throat went dry. What? The wind howled through the empty town, carrying whispers that twisted in the air like unseen ghosts. The figure tilted his head. You still don't see it, do you? Daniel swallowed hard. The revolver in his hand felt heavier, like it had fused with his bones. His mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of this impossible moment. The cowboy had been stuck in this duel for who knows how long, repeating the same scene over and over, unable to escape. But if this wasn't his duel, then whose was it? The figure took another step forward. The shadows clung to him like living things, shifting, writhing. Daniel took a shaky step back. Who are you? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure finally lifted his head. For the first time, Daniel saw his face, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The figure's face was not a face at all. It was a mask, old and cracked, like it had been buried in the dirt for centuries. The eyes behind the mask were hollow, empty voids, as though something had been erased from the soul that had once inhabited it. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just any ghost. This was the true presence that had haunted the mansion all along. The one who had been waiting. The second figure, the one who had been watching from the shadows in the film, had never been the cowboy. It was him. The figure stepped forward again, and the mask began to shift. The cracks in it seemed to deepen, like it was being pulled by some invisible force, warping with each movement. It was never about him, the figure said, his voice a rasping echo, like the sound of wind through a forgotten canyon. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Then what is this about? The figure paused, tilting his head as though considering him. His voice grew softer, almost regretful. It's about the forgotten one. The one who was lost before the story could even begin. Daniel's pulse raced. Who are you? The figure's form began to shift, his shape bending and stretching in unnatural ways. It was as if he were dissolving into the air, becoming a part of the very town itself. The town that had existed only in the moments between time. And then it became clear. The figure wasn't a ghost. Not in the way Daniel had come to understand them. He was the one who had never been remembered. He was the actor who had been left behind, forgotten in the chaos of the Western boom. The one who had never made it into the films. The one whose name had been lost, whose part had been cut, who had never been allowed to take his place on the screen. He wasn't merely the figure who had watched from the shadows, he had been the one who pulled the strings. The cowboy, the ghost of the old Western, had never been the true focus of this haunting. The figure in the mask had been waiting for someone to finally remember, to bring the story full circle, to finish what had been left unfinished. The story can't end until it's told, the figure whispered. Daniel's mind raced. The revolver in his hand felt like an extension of himself now, cold and heavy. He could feel it pulling him into the story, into the moment of the duel. He wasn't just standing in a ghost town anymore. He was standing in the gap, the forgotten space between every story ever told. You were the one who was meant to finish it. Before Daniel could ask what that meant, the world around him began to tremble. The ground beneath his boots cracked, the town warping and stretching, pulling apart like an old film reel unraveling. The cowboy's voice, distant and fading, echoed in the air, "Finish it. Finish the scene." Daniel's breath came fast. His mind screamed to run, but he knew there was nowhere to go. The moment had arrived. The unfinished duel was no longer something to be avoided. It was something to be completed. He closed his eyes, tightened his grip around the revolver, and whispered, "Make it count." And as the wind howled and the dust swirled in the air, the trigger was pulled, and the scene finally came to an end. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.